Welcome to Ozcast, the platform where we take a deep dive into the science and research behind the issues impacting Australian waterways. Each week, we team up with experts in their field to take a look below the surface. Martin, welcome back to Ozcast.
Hi, it's good to be back.
We've obviously done this before. We chatted about the health of a freshwater river, and we dived into an overview of your work around freshwater rivers in Australia. But today, we're going to dive into something a little bit more specific, right? And that is a topical issue at the moment, which is around a species that does inhabit our freshwater rivers and something that you've probably spent a lot of time on over your years, and that is carp, European carp.
Yeah.
And what I want to do today is eventually get to the problem that we found, I think it was about 2 months ago. We're recording this in early February of 2023, around this plague kind of run of these carp.
Yep.
But I kind of want to start where all good stories start.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this isn't a good story, it's a bad story, but where all kind of narratives start, and that is back when they got introduced.
Yeah.
Now, for those who are complete novice, carp are an invasive introduced pest species into Australian waters. That came, I think there was two key dates, and you'll be able to correct me on this shortly. I think 1963 was one of their first introductions, but I think there was an initial introduction before that didn't quite go to plan. So let's kind of start
Start at the beginning.
How did carp
Yeah.
come to Australia in the first place?
Yeah. Look, in fact, I think there's some earlier records than that. I think maybe even an 1890 record. So there are a few introductions. I mean, quite purposeful. It's a bit like bringing rabbits and foxes. We colonial Australia just wanted to bring some of these beasties in. So a few people brought carp in, but it's funny they initially didn't even do that well. So this is interesting. They were sort of around, but they just didn't do that well. And then in the 1960s, there was a strain that was brought into Victoria, and it was a strain called the Bullara strain. And for some reason, it just had a few extra attributes, and it took off. And then in the 70s, we had the 74 flood, and that provided carp with the opportunities to spread.
Right, so they weren't a success straight off the bat.
No, it's strange. They were not. There were introductions, and they didn't do too well.
Do we know, and we might not, but do we know what conditions Australia posed that they didn't like? Do we know?
Initially, no.
Yeah.
No, look, we know what they like now, and but we don't know what those early strains, why they didn't take off. We're not sure. But it is interesting that carp originally from Asia, and then from Eastern Europe, and carp are really the most translocated fish species in the world. So this is not just Australia's problem. Carp are in more countries than any other introduced species, but they come from rivers that are quite low gradient. They're not in steep mountain streams, and Australia is one of the flattest countries around, and we have lots of low gradient rivers and with their sandy, silty bottoms, and they feed by sifting through sediment, and so this habitat really suits them. But they've got a few other amazing attributes. I mean, you have to admire some part of them being so successful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though that I see carp, and I think the majority of the community sees carp as this resilient fish that can basically adapt to any condition they get thrown into. They're more resilient than our native fish, and they kind of like got an armour on them, right? Like a metaphorical armour on them.
Yes.
But I get a little bit of enjoyment out of knowing that when they first came here,
They struggled.
I
know. Me too. I get a bit of enjoyment.
You get a little bit of a kick.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And it's also a bit of a kick that it wasn't as if the first one dropped in and they spread like wildfire.
No.
It was as if it was a gradual and somewhat of a maintained effort to make sure they did work.
Exactly. It wasn't just one or two fish. They kept introducing different strains.
Actually. Do we know what the appeal was? Like obviously food, but is there a story behind what the initial reasons were for getting them here?
Actually, I'm not sure the original reasons.
It would be interesting to see if those reasons, I assume it would be food. I assume it was recreational fishing, because I think in every other country, like you said before, carp are considered, a great species. They're not considered a pest.
Well. Yeah, look, in Eastern Europe, where they're considered native there, but they're probably taken even from China there. No, they're highly prized. In Eastern Europe, highly prized by fishermen, highly prized to eat. And then probably those coastal rivers of Europe they've been introduced to, but they don't thrive like they do in Australia. They don't take over. So if a species doesn't change the ecosystem, people don't think it's a threat. And I think this is the difference in Australia. It's been a fundamental, huge impact on the ecosystem, and then it's seen as a threat.
So 1963, around that, so obviously the dates are slightly blurred, but it wasn't that long ago, right?
No.
We're not talking about fish that have been here for 200 years. You know, we're only talking about...
If I had the TARDIS, I would go back.
Would go back?
I'd go back to that strain. So don't
do
it.
Introduce that. So since then, basically, run us through the issues that carp pose. Like, why are they considered... detrimental to our native fish? What is it about them? What attributes do they have? What tendencies do they have? What are they stopping our native fish from doing?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's partly what carp do to the river. So they're constantly stirring up the sediments by feeding. They sort of siphon sediment and then filter out invertebrates and then blow the sediment back out. So you get more turbid water. And if you get more turbid water, then plants can't grow in it. The light can't penetrate the water. So that starts to change the ecosystem. And so you get, you don't get the clear water, you don't get the aquatic plants and some of those native fish that hang around aquatic plants. So they change the ecosystem. But in fact, there's a few dimensions to this. They're not just changing the ecosystem, we have changed the ecosystem to suit them. So we have modified rivers, and the way we've modified rivers suits carp.
So now that annoys me.
It annoys me too.
It annoys me to think that had the rivers been in their natural state, they wouldn't have thrived as much as they are now when we're, in the previous episode, we chatted about building these man-made structures and tampering with the river, which has only incrementally benefited the success of carp.
Yeah, so we spoke earlier about, some native fish need to migrate hundreds of kilometres. Carp are pretty smart. They can migrate and do migrate hundreds of kilometres, but they don't have to spawn and breed. They can move from the river to the floodplain, they can spawn, move back to the river. They can migrate a few kilometres and have a successful life cycle. So they can do that, but then with the big flood on, they can also disperse. So that's a pretty good suite of characteristics.
Right, and which is what probably sets them apart from the Murray cod, the golden perch. It's that extra 1 or 2% which allows them to thrive in some of those scenarios.
And their strategy of using these sort of floodplains, for juvenile fish, but not having to migrate or to complete their life cycle. And they tolerate poor, water conditions too. They can tolerate, low dissolved oxygen, obviously tolerate, high turbidity. The young fish, the sort of larvae, obviously quite flexible in what they feed. They can feed on a range of zooplankton, so there'd be direct competition with native fish there. So they've had a big impact on the ecosystem. But the more we modify the system, the more it suits non-native species. So the more we have weirs, I mean, they're a species that prefers a pretty sluggish weir pool rather than a steeply flowing river. You won't find them, extremely abundant in flowing rivers, but they get very abundant where we modify floodplains and modify rivers.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Is it that the carp is that much better than the cod, for example, or is it that the cod should be more resilient than it is? But if the carp is just being so much more superior than the cod, at some point do you just go, well, keep up, mate? You know what I mean? Like, I can't help to think that, come on, cod, do better.
Let's just accept the carp.
Just accept it, it's an argument that I think is floating around. People don't want to say it. People probably don't want to talk about it because it's a very unpopular opinion.
Yeah.
It's worth talking about.
Look, I think all viewpoints are worth talking about, and I think you've got to put all those on the table, and you've got to say, why don't we just accept carp as is? And I think this is a community decision. It's a bit like any introduced animals, like rabbits, or that sort of a prickly pear, or if we think it's damaging the society and damaging our values and what we want rivers to look like or what the landscape to look like, if we make that choice, well, then we need to deal with it. If we think, yep, I like carp and they're doing pretty well, yeah, so I think the community needs to be part of that choice. And importantly, we need to have First Nations people talking about this choice as well and what they want the rivers to be as well. So, if carp was not a pest, if they were in incredibly low numbers and not impacting native fish, I think probably you wouldn't spend a huge amount of effort trying to get rid of them. And in fact, you won't probably ever get rid of them. So the idea is you suppress the populations so the impacts are less, and then the native fish can take off. So the other narrative is the story is, let's just get rid of carp. They are here to stay. It's about managing them. And if you like, I'm next to a national park, and I know it's got lots of foxes. The national parks bait the foxes, and bandicoots do really well. So they just keep the fox numbers down. And that's what we need to do in rivers, just got to keep the carp numbers down.
So you're confident to say that carp are here to stay in Australia forever?
Yes. Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily have to be a negative. That's not that. I think someone could view that and go, "That's a really depressing fact." But like you said, the key is in managing them to the point where they're not posing, huge threats to cod. So what is it? Yeah. What are some of the solutions that we've tried in the past before we get to maybe looking in the future? Have we tried things in the past around managing carp?
Yeah. Look, we certainly have. And actually, I shouldn't say never too, because science is a bit unpredictable. And there was a very good idea which was called the daughterless carp project, which was all the offspring were males. So eventually the whole population of males, and therefore there are no females. So those genetic arguments or those genetic sort of methods may in 50, 100 years time be very sophisticated, and you may be able to do it. So we won't say never. Now, in terms of methods of getting rid of carp, people have tried lots of things, and they, on first glance, look pretty good. I mean, you can take out tons of carp out of rivers using cages at the top of fishways. There's the carp cage, the Williams carp cage, where the carp swim to the top of the fishway and then jump into a cage. You can take out tons and tons of carp doing that. You can have fishing, take out tons of carp, commercial fishing. But interestingly, when you run the science around this, you don't tend to damage the populations. If you keep taking the population down, the carp keep bouncing back. And so you can take out tons, but it needs to be more than that. That might be one of the tools in your toolkit. But now you've got to look at some other tools as well. And now we're going to talk about the carp herpes virus. And that's one of the promising tools. And so when that was very, very first mentioned, I thought, wow, okay, I'm not sure about introducing another virus. But I think now that they've done so much amazing research on it, they've shown there's population modelling that's showing they'll knock down the carp population by 40 to 60%. That would be totally amazing. That would be a big positive impact on rivers. So we need to have a discussion now about this carp herpes virus because there are risks. Because if you knock that fish population down, there's going to be a lot of dead carp. You've got a water quality issue. So you need to manage that, and so, but there's been a very good program around this, looking at the science of it. The science looks very good. The risks are very transparent. And now we have had that discussion, but it doesn't permanently knock down. It gives a breathing space for native fish to come back. So the other two-pronged approach here is, yes, we tackle carp. At the same time, you've got to bolster native fish and all the stuff around this. So you've got to bolster habitat, you've got to bolster flows, give native fish the best possible chance at the same time. So people might think, we'll take carp out and that'll be a silver bullet. No, you must do this other activities. You must provide more flows for fish, more habitat for native fish. When you do that, wow, you have got a good case.
What's the science behind a virus? What is the idea behind introducing a virus? Is it the same as something like COVID-19? Is it why the virus? Because for someone like myself who doesn't study this, I'm thinking, right, how's that going to work? What's it going to do? Is it going to literally kill them? Does it stop them spawning? Does it stop their appetite? You know, what does the virus do?
It kills them. But it doesn't kill all of them. And so it might kill 40 to 60%. So it kills the carp, and that is why there then becomes a problem in some areas of water quality. You know, because you've got dead carp floating. So we know what dead fish does to water quality. So that's the issue. So it kills them. But the thing is about the virus is it will spread throughout the river system. If you ask fishers to go in and get carp or commercial fishing, they won't go to the most remote locations. And so, you know, you find, in fact, you get targeted areas which look good. You get tons of carp out, but they're actually quite specific locations because we're sort of sparsely populated country. So yes, it will kill carp. It won't kill all of them, and it won't be long lasting. It'll then become in the population and hopefully keep carp populations suppressed.
Is there a risk that it also kills native fish?
So when it was first mentioned, that was my major concern. And but the research has been, and that's most researchers' early concern. Let's make sure we're not going to introduce something that's going to kill native fish. So they've done a lot of research around this, and I think it's very high quality research, and it looks like it will be no impact on native fish.
Excuse my ignorance, but how can you, is science that far ahead that we can introduce a specific virus that is only going to impact the carp? And
yes.
like, is that how far we are?
Oh, look, actually, this is a naturally occurring virus. So this is not a constructed virus. So this is a virus already in carp populations. So it's naturally occurring. So you've got actually test beds, if you like, in other rivers around the world where it occurs. And where it occurs there, it only occurs for carp species. And we have no native carp species. As I said in another podcast, in the Mekong, they've got hundreds of carp species. But in Australia, there are no native carp species.
Right. So you introduce it, it naturally flows throughout the water, basically the systems where you introduce it, which man can't get to, because of logistics in some respect, but the fact that it's going to get to nearly every nook and cranny in these systems. 40 to 60% is the expected rate of death. You're saying step number one is have a management system for the dead fish.
Yes.
Which looks like what?
Well, this is interesting, and I think there's a lot of work's gone into this about what you would do with, the spots you would introduce it and where spots you collect the dead fish. It has to be a very active management plan. And look, I think there's a couple of people you should probably talk to about this, which is Dr. John Kewen and Dr. Ivor Stewart, have both done a lot of research in this area. But there are other scientists that have done a lot of research in this area. But Ivor Stewart raises an interesting point that actually the virus might get here anyway, because viruses are pretty small. It's hard to keep viruses out of countries, and we have a big biosecurity issue in Australia, trying to keep other non-native plants and animals out. The virus might get here anyway, so we need actually to have the management plan ready. We don't want to wait. So actually, we need to have that up and ready. We need to be ready to manage water quality, be ready for towns to have it. Now, with that perspective, it makes me think, or maybe we should introduce it so we know where it goes and when it goes, and make sure there's enough flow to dilute these dead carp, if you like, not so it doesn't happen in a drought when all you've got is dead fish everywhere.
Something that comes to mind is, and again we've spoken about it previously, is if you have weirs which are stopping water flow, right, but then you've got dead fish because of the virus, is there not going to be a significant build-up of potentially dead fish matter at the point where there is a weir?
You could be on the management committee. You're spot on.
But yeah,
yes. Look, you're absolutely right, and so that becomes part of the management regime. You would like to release the virus when there's water flowing over the weir. You don't want to do it when there's no flow in the river, because that's exactly what will happen. With dead fish, and that's what happened with the fish kill. You had lots of dead fish and more nutrients in the water, and it was a real mess. So, you want to do it when the river's flowing.
Right, and then I guess the biggest part of this whole exercise as a nation, whatever you want to call it, as all these fisheries bodies coming together, is understanding that carp are not a state problem, it is a national problem.
Sure is, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
you know, federation, whatever you want to call it, this idea of dividing us all up, that has to somewhat be ignored, because if you were to introduce this virus in New South Wales, it's going everywhere. You know what I mean? So there's got to be a national plan. There's got to be a consolidated plan that everyone is like, right, we're in this together.
Yep.
We need the management system the same.
Yep.
That to me seems like a hurdle which is going to be a little bit...
Well, no, incredibly, so people have had exactly this discussion, exactly as you said, and it's called a national carp control plan. So the states have come together on this, and the scientists have come together on this. And so I think it's actually a really good example of cooperation. And so I think there needs to be further discussions and bring the community in that discussion. We want the community to be part of this decision making, have that discussion. You know, this is what's going to happen. Are you comfortable with that? And this is what we will do to manage it. There are some risks involved, you know, what we will do. So, yeah, it's a national issue with a national solution.
Is there a time frame on how quick the virus, or is there a window that we have once the virus is introduced where we need to act?
I think we'll be pretty quick. There's probably some data around this, but I don't know the exact data. But you would need to have all your strategies ready before you introduced it. Absolutely.
And by strategies, not only the management scheme, but also your habitat, your restoration, your riparian zones, your snags.
Yeah.
Your supporting native fish needs to have time to do its thing.
Absolutely. You want all of that in place, and you want to allocate some good water for native fish in that time. You want to have that all ready to go. And then, bang, introduce the virus, and native fish will take off.
So what is it about? So if the virus is not going to touch the native fish, hypothetically speaking, we can't ignore them, which is what you said. There's a two-pronged system. Introduce the virus, support the native fish. What's support native fish look like in your eyes? It's obviously, we know the basics, like you said, plant trees, riparian zones. Introduce snags, introduce rocks. Is there, eradicate piers. Basically building up river systems to suit native fish and not carp.
And look, and it's not rocket science, but habitat, number one. Habitat, far out, snags, rocks, riparian vegetation. Habitat, fish need habitat, that's basic. They need flow, number one. So we still got to get this flow stuff right, and everyone's got to get on board with it, and we can't have rivers, in droughts stopping. So they need flow, and with flow, as I mentioned, earlier, you want a flowing river. You don't want a flow going from one weir pool to the next. So that's part of flow. And fish have got to be able to migrate between all these habitats. And so you get those things right, absolutely.
Wow. So what's your thoughts on this idea that we could commercial fish freshwater rivers for carp? Because when I first heard it, I thought, well, sounds like a potential for it to go really bad. But I don't have a lot of experience in it. So
I thought initially it was quite a good idea. I actually thought that, we could get commercial fishers engaged in this, I think, and they'll be efficient and they'll get a lot of carp out. So I think initially I thought that was a good idea. Now, but what happens when it's commercial fishery is they want an ongoing return. They actually want carp populations to keep going, number one. So then you have to think, okay, we need to incentivise this. We need to have the government involved to, say, look, it's not just about, commercial. We need to actually try and, keep this population down. And you want commercial fishing to go to remote locations. Well, there's no incentive to go to remote locations. So and the other aspect of it is that, surprisingly, when you do the population modelling, it doesn't have a big impact. You can take out tons and tons of carp, but in this particular case, there's just young carp just keep coming through.
Well, that's what we've seen at the back end of 2022. So let's touch on that. There's recent plague, right? So from outside looking in, there was images on news stations of thousands, millions of carp, not only in freshwater rivers, congregating in little back eddies and up on floodplains, and I'm talking like the size of your hand, all the way through to them washing up on beaches, and millions washing up on saltwater beaches, incredible. What's your understanding of how this happened? And, where do we go forward from a plague perspective, not just the idea of having carp thriving. I'm talking plague proportions.
Yeah, look, this will be a huge long-term boost in carp numbers. So we're seeing a lot of dead carp. There's a lot of live carp in there. So this will be a boost. We'll see this in the next 3 or 4 years. Carp numbers will go up. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's highly predictable. When you get this big flood, it also was slightly unusually a summer flood with very warm water. And typically, say the Murray River would get winter spring floods, which are a bit cooler. And even the Darling would often get times you get floods in those periods, but this has been a big warm flood with a high nutrient load. So you're getting inundation of floodplains that haven't been flooded for a long time. So you're getting a lot of agricultural nutrients. So it's really suited carp, and it's probably also in lots of parts suited native fish as well. So we shouldn't forget that. We should see some boost to native fish hopefully in the next couple of years. So I'll be curious to see the monitoring, but. So that's why now is the time to have this conversation about carp, because they are very resilient. So after this flood, we have another drought, and the adults will just persist. They can tolerate low dissolved oxygen, and the next flood will happen again. So we need to have this conversation. Is this the rivers we want, or do we want to change it? And if we want to change it, well then we've got to have the discussion about the carp virus, and even all these other methods. I mean, maybe commercial fishing of carp, maybe that's just another method as well. I would put everything on the table, but right now the wide sweeping impact would be to introduce the carp virus. So you need to have that discussion around the risks, and we must do something for native fish, and we've got to do more for native fish, and we know the science around it. We can do more for native fish, and so. And that's how we... So
provided, I guess to wrap up, for a skeptic out there who thinks viruses are no good, for someone like yourself, your advice or your opinion is, provided we do it right, we support our native fish at the same time, and we have the right management schemes in place to deal with the consequences of introducing a virus, it will be a beneficial exercise for Australian rivers.
I think it is. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Sign off there. Okay. Thank you, Martin, again for joining us on Ozcast. Again, if you're just joining us, there's plenty of episodes in the content library which you can find on the Ozfish website. We dive into all weird and wonderful topics. Hopefully we'll get you on down the track in the future to talk about another issue, where it be some of your work over in Southeast Asia. I'm sure you've got plenty of other to talk about. We've got some of your colleagues coming on shortly, but until then, that is a look below the surface, and we'll catch you next time.
Great, thank you.
This episode of Ozcast is proudly supported by the Australian Government through the CRC program and BCF Boat and Camping Fishing.